Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. Hope you're doing well. I've got JP with me here. How are you, sir?
Doing very well, thank you. Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, this is going to be a great one. We are honored to have with us Cynthia Thurlow, the wonderful podcast host and author of the new book, The Menopause Gut. How are you, Cynthia? Thanks for joining us.
I'm doing great. I feel like I'm in a good position, a week before book launch where I'm, doing all the mindful things to manage my autonomic nervous system as proactively as possible.
Absolutely. And we're excited to have you here and excited to share this work because I think this is revolutionary for a lot of people that are dealing with the symptoms of perimenopause, menopause, and the effects that stress and autonomic dysregulation can truly have in here. I think this is exactly the type of topic that we want to share with our audience. And so we're really, really honored to have you on here. I would love to start off kind of giving you free rein to talk a little bit about your story and kind of what you've been going through that has brought you into really being interested in affecting the gut in a positive way to enable menopause to be as comfortable a process as possible. So tell us a little bit about what that kind of initial prompt was for you to write this book and what you've been experiencing over the last little bit.
Yeah. So to give everyone some perspective, I'm a traditionally trained allopathic nurse practitioner, spent 20 years in clinical cardiology and ER medicine. So I am a reformed adrenaline junkie. But 10 years ago, in the midst of perimenopause, I really had an awakening. It was very clear to me that although I fully believe and support my traditional allopathic peers, I was really tired of writing prescriptions for lifestyle-related issues. And so many of my patients were like, I'm not going to stop smoking. I'm not interested in exercising. I'm not changing my diet. And, it was a very small percentage of patients that were interested in doing that. And so I took this massive leap of faith, told my husband, I can't do this. I can't write one more prescription. Gave my notice. And on April 1st, 2016, started my own practice, really focused on women in perimenopause and menopause because I was truly suffering and no one had prepared me for what to expect, let alone the fact that as my physiology was changing, that super stressful job and not enough sleep and too much exercise and, the stress and demands that all of us understand that have small people at home and a husband who traveled. And so for me, the last 10 years of my life have been myopically focused on women at this stage of life. But what got me most interested in the gut, and this is where life imitates art. So 8 years ago, I went on a very romantic trip with my husband to Morocco, and we ate the same food and had the most wonderful time, but one of us got deathly sick from food poisoning and the other did not. Same food. My husband's 2 years older than me, and I was deathly sick. And I did not fully appreciate or understand how that hormonal decline in perimenopause primes our immune system to be more reactive, to have the response that my body had. And so that's how I start the book. But that is what got me initially concerned. And then I was seeing patterns clinically with patients where we would do diagnostic testing. And I was like, I don't fully understand why I'm seeing this pattern, but I can see it. And when you see it often enough, you're like, this is not just coincidental. There's clearly something happening as these hormones are declining that impacts autoimmunity, impacts our immune system function, dysregulates our autonomic nervous system. And so for me, it has really been this mission over the past 10 years. And when my editor came to me in 2024 and said, do you think you have a second book in you? I said, I do, but it's just like literally throwing ideas on paper. And for anyone that's listening, when you write a formal book proposal for a big publishing company, it is 100 pages worth of effort. This was one page, distilled down into one page. It was like, this is my idea. This is what I think no one is talking about. This is why I think the gut microbiome interfaces with every single organ system. And it is so forgotten. We are so myopically focused on bone, brain, and heart health, which clearly are very important for women, right? I don't want to disregard that. However, I think from the perspective of like a very macro level, we're not talking about the gut enough. We're not understanding the interface with all these other systems in the body. And the way to really help women mitigate symptoms and be able to have a higher quality of life really makes us need to focus much more on the microbiome. And so I humbly sit back and say, this is the most important thing I've ever done professionally. It's what I'm most proud of. And I have been hearing from many podcast hosts and people that I've spoken to in the media, and they're like, your book is groundbreaking. And I share this not because I'm wanting a pat on the back. It's to say that we finally are getting to a point in time where we are open to having these discussions and making it more than just distilling the hormonal decline to 3 body systems and saying nothing else is affected. Effectively, with these changes in neurotransmitters and hormones, everything is affected. And so really thinking about the gut microbiome as the epicenter of this hormonal change in women's lives.
I love that you've been able to kind of connect these things that people hadn't necessarily put the gut hormone connection together. And obviously, when you're going through hormonal changes, both in the perimenopause, menopausal period, and even for younger children and teens and puberty, there are massive changes that are affected by gut health and how gut health plays a massive role on hormones. And I love that you've brought up stress, you've brought up the autonomic nervous system, and this relay point that the gut hormone connection is built through or relayed through the autonomic nervous system and the vagus nerve. Talk a little bit about the gut hormone connection and what role does the microbiome play in creating hormonal changes or enabling hormonal changes? And then you also relayed the immune system. So we'll get into that after.
Yeah, I always like to start with estrogen. So estradiol is the predominant form of estrogen that women's bodies make up until menopause. There are other types of estrogens, but they're weaker. Estradiol is really at the forefront of understanding the microbiome because there is a special estrogen processing area in the microbiome called the estrobolome. I did not name it. Someone asked me the other day, did you name that? And I was like, no. Someone much smarter than me named it the estrobolome. The estrobolome is where our body can effectively break down and process, hopefully, and eliminate estrogen. And it's interesting because there are specific estrogen receptors as well as estrogen bacteria that are there that will effectively, we have 2 main sites of detoxification for estrogen in the microbiome. First, we're really speaking to the liver. There's phase 1, phase 2. If we're able to break things down into water-soluble compounds, it goes to the gut. So gut health becomes critically important because if you don't have enough beta-glucuronidase, if your microbiome is not optimal and you're heading into this time in a woman's life where we know estradiol can be 20 to 30% higher in certain menstrual cycles, there's a lot that's going on. But if you can't effectively break down, package up the estrogen and poop it out of the body, I'm really oversimplifying things, you run the risk of recirculating it. Now, it's very much a Goldilocks effect. You do want a little bit of recirculation, but not too much. So for a lot of women, when their body is not able to effectively break down the estrogens, it gets recirculated, which drives a lot of the symptoms that women experience. Brain fog, vasomotor symptoms, breast tenderness, weight loss resistance, many things that women don't want to experience. But it can be a magnifying lens of whether or not we're able to effectively metabolize and break these things down. Other things about estrogen and the microbiome that I think are interesting is estrogen is intricately interwoven with bile acid synthesis. So if you are not in a position where you have enough estrogen, you are going to have a harder time breaking down and emulsifying fats. So for a lot of women, they'll notice that they may have more, fatty-looking stools that kind of lay at the top of the toilet. And sorry, as a healthcare provider, I just like to bring these little insights in because it makes it a little bit more kind of literally tangible. But for many women, not understanding as estrogen's declining, their ability to break down and emulsify fats, their ability to utilize bile acids, which also are involved in the estrobolome, start to become diminished. When I think about the immune system and the microbiome and estrogen, I also understand that estrogen and the immune system are also intricately interwoven. As estrogen is declining, we will see alterations in things like the small intestinal lining, which is only 1 cell layer thick. And if you think of it as a brick and mortar system, estrogen is the mortar. So as estrogen's declining, we're more likely to experience leaky gut, more autoimmunity, 4 to 5 times more likely to experience autoimmunity. Also, if we ingest a pathogen like I did when I was in Morocco, it will help mount this massive immune response. So these endotoxins or lipopolysaccharides, which are not good things, we don't want to leak those into our bloodstream. If that small intestinal lining is breached, if those tight junctions are open, it'll trigger an immune response, and then things leak into our bloodstream, triggering more systemic effects. And so estrogen and the immune system are, and it's a terrible analogy to make, but they're like peanut butter and jelly. They just go together. And as estrogen's declining, I think many women are surprised to know that they are more likely to develop food sensitivities. They may experience more GI symptoms, more gas and bloating, and that interrelationship, that bidirectional relationship between the gut and brain. So that vagus nerve, and actually more information goes from the gut to the brain than the other direction. So very important for people to know that a lot of the symptoms we experience, not just as women, but men also, understanding if your gut is not healthy, if there's a lot of inflammation in the gut, or you have a reduction in neurotransmitter production, so all these mood issues, a lot of the drugs that I used to prescribe for patients, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they're designed to act in the brain, but it's actually the gut where these neurotransmitters are produced from. So there's a lot that goes on that I think a lot of individuals are probably not aware of, but are a sign of alterations in gut microbiome activity vis-a-vis estrogen. And then also this piece about the immune system. And then last, I would just mention, I can tell you with certainty for 25 years of working with patients, we have normalized constipation. And it's important for people to know that if you poop once or twice a week, all those things that your body's trying to get rid of, and I want to say the word toxins, like things that have already, your body has taken everything nutrient dense out of the food you've eaten and packaging up estrogen and other metabolites, and it's just getting recirculated. So I remind people, your bowel frequency is relative and incredibly important. And that's why the role of, some of these nutritional paradigms, lifestyle measures become even more important in the setting of less hormones and changes in physiology.
Yeah, there's something really true about the all disease arises from the gut. I mean, what you're talking about is a dysregulation of tolerance. So when you're young, you have a better ability to recognize what bugs you should be tolerant of and which ones you shouldn't. We have trillions of them in our gut. We need to be tolerant of many of them. But when a bad one comes along, you need to recognize it. You need to have that barrier in place to prevent the immune system from going haywire. So absolutely, by all means, the withdrawal of estrogen, the change in hormones can have a profound effect on the gut. And the entire system is a symphony. So it needs a conductor. And as you pointed out, the brainstem and the vagus nerve, the autonomic nervous system, are the conductors. They make certain that all the three biggies that you were talking about, your heart, your brain, et cetera, those systems function only when the entire system is functioning properly. So great for you to have put these pieces together and get something out for the general public to be able to recognize this. It's good work.
Thank you. Well, and it's interesting because when I was writing the immune system chapter, and I kept saying to my publisher, I was like, the immune system's complicated. And I say this as someone that has a solid science background, that understands things at a deep physiologic level. And I had a big whiteboard. Like, I'm married to an engineer. I'm the mother of a training engineer right now. And they were both laughing at me because I had this massive whiteboard. And I said, you don't understand. I don't expect anyone to think I'm an immunologist, nor do I want to pretend to be one. I said, but the immune system is so intricately complicated that when you start to understand this rise in autoimmunity, when you start to understand why women have less vaccine efficacy transitioning into perimenopause and menopause, why our immune system effectively just becomes a cranky toddler, it helps people understand, like, why am I getting sick more frequently? Why do we see increasing rates of certain types of cancers in middle age? And a lot of it has to do with this immune system that just starts to unwind. And we don't yet have a clinical indication for hormone replacement therapy for the immune system or the gut. But I do think these things will be coming. Eventually, we will have clinical indications as we understand at a deeper level that the hormones do not exist in isolation. And it is not just about, again, the triad of bone, brain, heart health, although very important. 1 in 3 women will die of heart disease. It's important to have these conversations. But there's so much more to the conversation than, just 3 systems that are impacted by these changes.
No, there's no question. The immune system is critically important. I personally view it as the other side of the coin of the nervous system, who are working in harmony most of the time. And when they're not, you are going to have every form of disease that there is. If you break down all the way back to the most fundamental systems, and you look at where dysregulation and aging happens, it's really, it's NF-kappa B, constantly being activated, which is going to upregulate your immune system, inflammation. It's your reactive oxygen species being created in your mitochondria more frequently and causing all sorts of wreaking havoc everywhere. It's a breakdown of your ability to create NAD and use NAD, which is probably a little more technical than we need to get into. And so these things are where the fundamentals of aging begin. I'm interested, because I'm always interested in mitochondria. How do you weave in sort of a mitochondrial dysfunction into this picture of menopause and the gut?
Well, it's interesting because dysfunctional mitochondria are at the basis of most, if not all, chronic disease states. When patients tell me that they are tired, I'm oftentimes thinking it is not just about replacing hormones. It is very likely that you have a degree of dysfunctional mitochondria that we need to address, because as that mitochondrial membrane gets stretched, I mean, it's supposed to be like curved. As it gets flattened, you can't generate ATP. And so the conversations really have to be more than this very superficial slap on your estrogen patch and it fixes everything. I always say, like, the body is beautifully complicated, but mitochondria, and especially because my first book was talking about intermittent fasting as a way to kind of harness metabolic health, helping people understand that if you can't generate ATP, it does not matter. It does not matter about any other intervention. So when you talk about precursors for NAD like NMN, NR, sometimes patients will say, well, I'm just going to take one supplement that's going to supplement NAD for the precursor. I'm just going to upregulate mitophagy and that's going to fix everything. And I'm like, I wish it were that simple, but there's so much more to the conversation. And so I love that you're talking about it at very much a cellular level, dusting off those cobwebs for listeners that are like, oh yeah, I remember learning about mitochondria, but if that mitochondrial membrane is not healthy due to chronic stress, aging, toxicants that we are exposed to in our personal care products, food, or environment, that can just make it worse. And I think that I use perimenopause as a litmus test for how well women have taken care of themselves throughout their lifetime. So you can get away with a lot in your teens, 20s, and 30s. You hit 40 and things start to shift. And I don't say this as like anyone that's younger than I doesn't understand. I don't ever say that because they'll figure it out eventually. Like even my very athletic adult sons, like they'll say things sometimes and my husband are like, eventually you understand, but that's okay. But the point being that at a very basic physiologic level, if you cannot generate ATP because you have dysfunctional mitochondria, that is like step one in the problem. Like you actually have to address that effectively. And so for a lot of people, they think it's just about, and I say this over and over again on podcasts, and I'm sorry if I keep it, but I keep saying this over and over again. If you think it is just about replacing hormones, it is a much larger, more nuanced conversation. And that's why these kinds of conversations are so vitally important.
So what are some of the advice that you give people in order to get them to resuscitate, rebuild their mitochondrial capacity? I mean, do you talk with them about things like urolithin and egg? You sort of hinted at that with enhancing biogenesis. Do you talk about methylene blue? Because yeah, you're right. Cardiolipin oxidation and leakiness at complex 1 and complex 3. You got to shuttle those electrons across, and methylene blue helps do that. Do you talk about exercise? You said people say, I'm not going to exercise. Okay, but that's how we evolved. We evolved exercise. So
No, thankfully the patients now are very motivated. It's a different, I get to spend more time with them. We get to have deeper conversations. I get to weave in things that include medications if appropriate, but all the way up to targeted peptides, supplements, et cetera. So yes, we talk about hormetic stressors. We talk about polyphenols. We talk about intermittent fasting, that's appropriate for them, because we know that being able to utilize different types of fuel substrates becomes critically important, especially with the aging process, especially with the degree of mitochondrial decline, sarcopenia, loss of insulin sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, definitely talk about those things. And what's interesting is, because I have my own podcast, I had a series of physician thought leaders, one after another. And honest to God, they happened to all be on the same day. And every single one of them, they didn't know what anyone was talking about with me separately. Every single one of them hammered home the mitochondria. They're like, we are not thinking at a cellular level. We're just thinking upstream. And yes, it's still important. But if you're not fixing the mitochondria and upregulating mitophagy, then all these interventions are not essentially going to be very effective. And so I think for a lot of individuals, that's a little bit of a step back from what they've been hearing. And I think it is also important because I was laughing with this one physician thought leader who's one of my favorite peptide experts. She's a medical doctor. And I said to her, I said, do you realize, like, I'm thinking back to biochemistry as an undergrad, like some of the terms and the things that you're talking about. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're so correct. And so I think for a lot of individuals, it's a higher level conversation. And sometimes it's hard to translate the science into something that's actionable. So that's why I think methylene blue is great, urolithin A, looking at exogenous ketones, if that's appropriate for the individual. All of these things are really important just to make people aware. And especially because we have a culture in the health and wellness space that is very supplement heavy. And I'm all for supplements if we indeed know that we need them. But for a lot of people, they just get overwhelmed. They're like, I don't even know where to start. And that's, again, why these conversations can be so helpful.
I'm a big proponent of supplements being supplemental, not being the prime driver of kind of the changes that you're looking to make. And you mentioned intermittent fasting. I would love to dig into that a little bit with you here. You mentioned something along the lines of when it's appropriate in certain situations. And I completely agree with you here. I'm sure we're very similar minded. But bioindividuality matters so much when it comes to making decisions about each individual's care, which is why N of one medicine really is becoming what it is. And I'm so happy that we're able to lean in that direction. Let's talk a little bit about when intermittent fasting tends to be more appropriate and when it should be avoided. Are there certain factors that you're looking at that help somebody decide whether that's a tool that they should be utilizing and the intensity with which they should be utilizing it?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And I actually wrote my first book was talking specifically about this, but even I have evolved since then. That book was written in 2022. I've been very transparent, and I want to be transparent with your community to say in 2024, I lost my dad. And boy, that left me with just an indelible impression of, oh my gosh, if I don't work harder at maintaining muscle, I will be just like my dad, who is kind of a little person. And I'm a little person. But the point of why I'm interjecting that is that I think intermittent fasting has to have a season and a reason. I think there are times in our lives where it's a great strategy. It's a hormetic stressor. I think, unfortunately, we have now gotten to a point where a lot of people are fasting who should not be. So let me be very clear about what that is. If your goal is to build muscle, intermittent fasting may not be the right strategy for you because many people and I'm saying people, it's men and women, go far too long without eating. And we know then the absence of, by the time you wake up in the morning, you're already catabolic in most instances. So if you are trying to maintain muscle and build muscle, 12 to 13 hours of digestive rest is fine. However, 92 to 93% of Americans are not metabolically healthy. So guess what? A lot of people can benefit from eating less often. And so it's part of the conversation of, are you metabolically healthy? If the answer is yes, less fasting. If the answer is no, which is most people, intermittent fasting can be a great strategy to help utilize, get to a point where you're both utilizing stored glycogen and fatty acids as fuel. And what many people do not realize is that the meal frequency recommendations that healthcare professionals like myself used to give, I always say, know better, do better. I finished my nurse practitioner program in 2001, so it's been a long time. But the advice I was giving patients at that time is frankly wrong. I used to tell them to have 3 meals a day and snacks in between to stoke their metabolism. So really important for people to understand you are not going to die if you go 3 to 4 hours between a meal. Your body is able to effectively utilize stored fuel to maintain your blood glucose, to maintain mentation, et cetera. But when I'm thinking about higher level reasons for why people should fast or should eat less often, it's almost always tied into metabolic health markers. I think for a lot of individuals, there are clear contraindications. These would be things like if you're already underweight, if you have a distorted relationship with food. I do not think intermittent fasting is appropriate for children or even teenagers. If you are still growing, and teenagers, their brains are still developing until 25, their prefrontal cortex. I would never encourage my teenagers to fast. Or if someone is frail or elderly, like they're probably already struggling to get enough food in. And I made the mistake when I did my second TED Talk of giving an age, and the amount of angry hate emails that my team and I had to field. I said, you don't understand, the TEDx people required me to give an age. And I realized there are plenty of people in their 70s and beyond who are completely metabolically healthy and can fast as much as they want to. So I think it always goes back to, from my mindset, are you metabolically healthy or not? The other piece of the puzzle is, if you are a menstruating woman, if you are still in your peak fertile years under the age of 35, I am very cautious with fasting. If you are thin, lean, athletic, really the only time I think you can get away with a bit of fasting is in the follicular phase when estrogen predominates, when your body can tolerate a bit more hormetic stress. You could do tougher workouts. You can probably get away with a little carbohydrate restriction versus the luteal phase. Now, if someone has PCOS, which is the number one endocrine disorder that we see in women, not thyroid disease, but PCOS, those women can do quite a bit of fasting, and especially if they're overweight or obese. On the other side, perimenopause, 5-10 years preceding menopause, it's so dependent on your stress levels, your sleep patterns. Are you eating enough food? This is something that not enough people that are fasting experts talk about, but I do. I'm like, are you getting at least 100 grams of protein in a day? Then you have no business fasting. And I think depending also where a perimenopausal woman is in her cycle is important. And then we have menopause, where less hormonal fluctuation. However, we know in the perimenopause to menopause transition, women become much less stress resilient. So if a woman is not sleeping and she's overexercising and she's underfueling, so it's a relative energy deficiency beyond just the caloric restriction, those are the people I worry about the most, because we still have a culture of thin is in. I don't care what anyone says. GLP-1 drugs, I think they're powerful drugs. I think they're important drug therapy for the right person. This has just reaffirmed to me that people will, at the expense of muscle, will choose to be thin. Now, I'm not saying that's healthy. I'm just saying, like, that is the reality. Every time there's an award season, I never comment on women's bodies on social media. I think women do just a real disservice to one another by being unkind. But all you have to do is see what women look like in award season, and you can tell they are really amping up everything they can do to be as thin as possible. So intermittent fasting is a great hormetic stressor used at the right time with the right person. Women have more little caveats around that. But if you are not sleeping and you are not managing your stress, please do not intermittent fast. It's literally like throwing gasoline on a fire, and not enough people talk about it. And I feel like I will always be apologizing for this. I probably did not emphasize that enough during the trajectory of the popularity of intermittent fasting as someone that is thought of as a metabolic health expert.
You know, as a person who is an intermittent faster myself, I appreciate the fact that it's not appropriate for some people. And for women, especially as you mentioned, during their fertile years, it can be something of a dangerous thing if they're already in good shape. But the vast majority of people in the United States are metabolically unhealthy and are overweight. And as a result, I feel as if the risks are just outweighed by the benefits that they would get from choosing to restrict calories, obviously, but also to become metabolically flexible. And when you force the body through intermittent fasting to enter that catabolic state, you're also forcing the transition over to using ketones and relying and having your mitochondria become flexible. They're not going to be using glucose all the time. So they have to sort of relearn how to use short chain fatty acids and other fatty acids for energy. And that's so critical. And it also is important because it restores your insulin sensitivity. And I think we've talked about this on the podcast, but I just want to reiterate it because it's so important. If you are a person who is overweight and is looking to lose weight, your body will not give up the fat. It will not allow that fat out of the cells if your insulin levels are high, which means that if you eat, 2 hours before you go work out, that workout is not going to get rid of fat. You are not going to mobilize any fat because the insulin levels are still going to be high. You're not going to mobilize fat. You're going to rely on the energy that you just took in that's gotten into your bloodstream as glucose. That's not really doing anything. You have to exercise and you have to burn those calories and you have to mobilize that fat out of those fat cells, when you're in that catabolic state. So work out in the morning. Don't eat before you go work out. Go 10, 12 hours before you work out. Do the workout and then eat afterwards. That you will have mobilized all the fat that you need to. And once you get to the point where those mitochondria are flexible, the weight will come off very rapidly. It will not happen immediately. That's why people get so frustrated. They'll go out and they'll start working out and they'll try to lose weight and they'll diet and they'll see no change in the first month and they'll get frustrated and they'll stop. You have been doing some really, really important foundational work during that first month. Even though no weight loss happened, you were changing your metabolism so that it was able to lose weight. It's like building a house. You can't just, start building wood frames on dirt. You have to build a foundation. And nobody else is going to see that foundation, but there's a lot of work that went in before you were able to build a stable house. So just my I don't know, almost, proselytizing rant there. But I think I'm really happy to know that you also wrote a book on intermittent fasting and the importance of it.
Yeah. And I think because of all those years of working in clinical cardiology, I saw what happened when people didn't take the lifestyle piece seriously enough. I worked in a very stressful part of the United States on the East Coast. Washington, D.C. is a pressure cooker. I would sometimes see patients in clinic and I would walk into a room and I could almost feel the amount of stress between the traffic and the expensive housing and stressful jobs and everything else. And they would say, Cynthia, I don't want to get up earlier. I don't want to change what I'm eating. And I just said, well, I can only increase your blood pressure medicine so much. I can only increase your lipid management so much. Like at some point, there needs to be some lifestyle buy-in. And I think, again, it comes down to building awareness around the fact that if we look at how our ancestors lived, they moved their bodies, they slept when appropriate, they ate less processed, nutrient-dense food. They didn't eat often because food wasn't plentiful. And I think that as we get closer and closer and closer to not needing to leave our houses, like literally we're now at a time, I was saying to my kids, I was like, you don't understand, like this is the first time in my adult lifetime that I recall, like I literally, if I didn't need to, I would not have to leave my home because I can just get on Amazon and order just about anything I need that would have necessitated me going to 5 different stores. And I said, that's interesting from a societal perspective that we have gotten so desensitized, deconditioned from movement, from socialization. It's fascinating to me. I know that's not the impetus for this conversation, but just from that perspective, like we are getting so far away from what is considered to be ideal and optimal from a physiologic perspective, just by virtue of our modern day lifestyles.
I completely agree with this. And I just want to emphasize it. I know it's not our topic, but let's actually dive into this for a second because it's really, really important. Yes, modern amenities and modern opportunities, as you said, to order anything you want on Amazon is valuable. It's fun. It makes things easy, but it also detracts away from how we evolved. And the way you have to use it, it's like with great power comes great responsibility. You have the power not to have to go to 5 different stores and run around and select your food even off the grocery store shelves because Instacart will bring it to you. But take that time that you get back and use it in a way that you need to mimic in a positive way. Get a group of friends and go on a walk. Okay. You got that hour and a half back? Go on a 60, 75-minute walk with a group of friends. Talk, have fun. Don't just sit in your house. Don't just sit in your house and become, more stressed about something that's associated with work. You gotta use that time wisely. So I applaud you for saying that. I'm a huge believer in that.
It's a paradoxical thing, right? That we've almost created so many comforts that we have lost the ability to have stress resilience. We've lost the ability to handle stressors. And so new stressors pop up, biochemical stressors, physiological stressors, emotional, day-to-day stressors, and it shows up because it's filling that bucket far more easily. And that's such a paradox that we've built such a comfortable day-to-day life that we don't have that capacity. That's where hormesis, hormetic stressors come in and allow for us to build our adaptive stress resilience capacity. And it's unfortunate that that's what this comfortable life has really created.
can I ask a quick question? Because you mentioned something before, and I just wanted to circle back on it. When I was talking about mitochondrial health and the various different supplements and other things that can be taken to sort of kickstart biogenesis and kickstart the electrons moving properly in the gradient, you mentioned peptides, and I'm very, very interested in some of these peptides and what it is that they do. I'm assuming that you might have been talking about MOTS-c as a peptide for mitochondria. What's the advice that you give people around MOTS-c?
Oh, well, I will say first and foremost, I do not prescribe MOTS-c. I just know the basics around it. I utilize things more for like thymic support, thymic peptides, GLP-1s, things like that. I think my kind of prevailing methodology around peptides and advice is number one, you want to work with someone who prescribes them. That's number one, not an MLM company that's out there with someone who can't prescribe telling you what you should and shouldn't be doing. That's my first thought process. Number two is you want to work with someone that they have a great deal of familiarity. Like I have had one podcast guest who I think of as my peptide expert. If I have questions, I go to her. Elizabeth Urith, she's a phenomenal expert, speaks all over the world about peptides, and I've learned a ton through her. And she's actively involved working with the FDA to try to get peptides that have high quality research pushed through, as opposed to some of the experimental stuff that, even she would say, I that's not the type of things that I want to be using with patients. So I think that let the buyer beware and make sure you're working with someone that, number one, can prescribe, and number two, can source them properly. It's getting harder and harder. Some of the thymic peptides, like thymosin alpha-1 as an example, which was one of my personal favorites, it's been near impossible to get access to that for almost a year now. Although I still talk about it when I do talks because I think it's important. I'm like, well, this will eventually change. But I think for a lot of individuals, it's helping them understand you want to use something. If you're going to use a peptide, you want to make sure you're working with someone that can prescribe them and also understands how to properly counsel you on potential benefits and also contraindications, because the health and wellness space loves to talk about peptides, and they also love to talk about anabolics, and they love to talk about hormones. And I always say, like, let the buyer beware. Like you genuinely, you don't want the person that's a cowboy. You want the person who has fine-tuned their utilization of hormones, anabolics, if that's appropriate for you, and peptide therapies, so that you are being conservative. Because I think that's, and maybe that's part of my traditional allopathic background. I'm a little conservative. I'm like, when we talk about bioindividuality, I want to limit or eliminate the potential for side effects as much as possible.
Spoken like a true clinician. I love that.
And I want to echo that as well. My personal feeling is that any peptide that has its origins in something that your body already makes, things like, in the case of MOTS-c, it's actually a mitochondrial peptide that we do make ourselves. It just declines with age.
Yep, like everything else.
Well, that's true. Most things do. But yes, but some of these fully synthetic peptides that have been manufactured in a lab and people are just throwing them into bodies and seeing how they work, that's risky. I would steer clear of that. But thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. It's interesting. My husband, who's not in the health and wellness space, we were looking at someone that I had met in the health and wellness space. I won't even say gender-wise who this individual was, but I said, this is not typically how this gender looks. This is clearly anabolics. This is clearly someone who's using a lot of growth hormone peptides. I mean, it is so evident, and I'll just say it's a female. But the point being, I was saying to him, this is just so highly unusual that, sometimes when people see things on social media, I always say, let the buyer beware, because that person is probably utilizing things in a way to an extreme, just like any type of, well, I don't want to consider that to be a hormetic stressor, but any type of stressor to the body. You want to be conservative and conscientious, because in some instances, we may not fully appreciate or understand what the long-term use may look like 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Let's shift gears back to the gut a little bit and discuss the microbiome and specific potential markers that you're looking for. I have done quite a bit of stool testing as well in the past. And are there specific markers? Are there specific, you mentioned beta-glucuronidase obviously is a big one. That's one that I'm very conscious of when I'm taking a look. What else are you looking at in a gut microbiome or a gut test to tell you where somebody stands and what recommendations you want to make to help them optimize for hormonal balance down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from the perspective, is there evidence of a significant degree of dysbiotic organisms? So these can be inflammatory, potentially pathologic organisms, and dysbiosis and leaky gut and autoimmunity all go together. So we know with this decline in hormones in women, we start seeing more lack of diversity. So some of the keystone bacteria that are designed, I would say, like you're planting a vegetable garden, fruits and vegetables. What grows up in between that you don't want are the dysbiotic organisms. You don't want them to take hold and further diminish the diversity of the keystone bacteria. So looking at that, looking at other opportunistic infections, is there signs of a latent fungal infection? I can definitely on stool testing get a sense or a gestalt of, do we see SIBO, patterns of SIBO, other opportunistic infections like H. pylori, parasites, worms occasionally we see. Do they have enough digestive enzymes? So like talking about digestive fire, do they have sufficient hydrochloric acid? Do they have enough digestive enzymes? Are they not able to effectively break down and emulsify fat, and they end up having a lot of fecal fat, so high steatocrit? Looking at the immune markers, so SIG-A, I always say that, when I'm explaining to patients numbers, I'm like, if the numbers are high, it's telling me there's something acutely going on. If numbers are low, it's like the troops have been out for battle for far too long and too many of them have been killed off. So this is like a compromised immune system. Looking at calprotectin, which is an inflammatory marker. I think all of those from a functional integrative lens are things that I'm thinking about. I just started working with another company looking exclusively at microbiome, and that has been interesting. Looking at short chain fatty acid production, getting a very personalized through shotgun genomics, getting a really personalized look at fecal fecal samples. And so that is what I think is the next level. Like PCR has been good, but there are limitations. And so I think next level is going to be really looking at these microbiome tests in a way that we're being thoughtful. Again, it's a very much that personalized bio-individual approach. But here's the thing, 90% of what I think I need, I get from a really good history. So when you're working with a provider, working with someone who's going to ask you more than 2 questions, working with a provider that's going to give you like a very detailed evaluation. And just like I tell students, I'm like, the one thing that, one thing that I was known for when I worked in a traditional environment was like, you get patients to tell you things no one else does. And I was like, well, I just listen. Half the battle is listening to your patient. So if someone's having a lot of bloating, if someone's feeling they're sensitive to everything, there's probably a larger amount going on. But let's be fully transparent. There are people who are so disconnected from their bodies. They'll tell you they feel nothing, and their stool analysis and their microbiome testing and everything else might look horrible. I think it's because we also have a population that's largely disconnected from their bodies. So it is probably more of a rarity that people are like, oh my gosh, I have all these symptoms, because many people just fly at 30,000 feet. Like they don't even acknowledge that they're having any symptoms. Like I have a spouse who is not a complainer by nature. When I say not a complainer, not a complainer. He had full-blown tuberculosis. And it was like I had to literally harangue him to go to the ER to get evaluated. And then I said, okay, from this point forward, you are not a reliable historian anymore. So from now on, I will sound the bell and I will de-obligate you from being able to tell me that you feel crummy. Just not a complainer by nature. So some patients will be very upfront with the symptoms they're experiencing, but a lot of what we need as clinicians is a really good history. That is more informative. It allows me to take a greater sense of what direction to go in with patients, as opposed to, someone fills out a form of 3 questions. I'm like, that doesn't tell me enough.
Based on what you mentioned, I'm pretty sure we are using the exact same stool test.
Yes.
And
I didn't know if you could say
we're
brands.
shifting over. We're totally fine. So
I
I was using GI Map for a very long time. Phenomenal tool, phenomenal test. PCR was great. I've made that shift towards Tiny Health and shotgun genomics, and it's been amazing. I do want to dig into a few things that you mentioned there, that you may have complete dysbiosis, but your gut seems to be functioning in a good way, or some people lack keystone bacteria and they're constipated and they're bloated. And really what we're looking at here is vagus nerve dysfunction as a big part of that, right? Vagal tone plays a huge role in gut motility and making sure that things are moving in the right direction. You mentioned gallbladder, you mentioned bile salts specifically. Gallbladder is where the bile is stored. That's where it gets pumped out. And guess what? One of the most common surgical procedures is a cholecystectomy, where you're taking your gallbladder out. And that happens because you aren't tonally being able to pump the bile into the intestinal tract. And so it sits there and it creates stones in the gallbladder. These are all signs of vagus nerve dysfunction. And I think it leads us into this conversation of stress and stress management a little bit, because that's really the ultimate goal here, is to build up stress resilience such that the body can function optimally through the hormonal transitions of menopause. Let's talk about stress management practices and tools that you're looking at and how you evaluate stress when you're talking to your patients.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, we still have this constellation of women, me being one of them, that used to be this way, that we are high functioning, we are exceedingly successful, we're high achieving. We've just subjugated stress for so many years that it is not until that perimenopause transition, in the setting of less neurotransmitters and less hormones, that the proverbial wheels fall off the bus, meaning our adaptive strategies when we're younger become maladaptive. So for me, I've always been an exerciser, and I've been someone that worked in very high acuity areas in medicine, probably because I wanted to prove something to myself. So for me, and for a lot of these patients, it's identifying who's at greater risk. Like, who are the people, like, is it the type A's? Yes. It is the super type A's, the ones, the perfectionistic tendencies, the ones I worry about the most, because they think it isn't relevant. They're like, I've had plenty of stress. I function well under stress. I don't need to worry about stress management, until they realize they do need to manage stress management. So it's getting a sense of your patient, like the type B's that are more laid back. I think that they generally have an easier time navigating hormonal decline because they're just much more easygoing about it. Whereas the type A's are like, well, I can't control the weight gain, and I can't control the sleep, and I feel like I can't deal with things. I think individuals that also have a history of PMS, PMDD, ADD, ADHD, they also, in the setting of alterations in dopamine signaling, serotonin, GABA, oh my gosh, they are so sensitive to these hormonal neurotransmitter fluctuations. So it's assessment of the patient to get a sense for what they need. It's also buy-in for what stress strategies do you like doing and that you can do consistently. Like, I've changed my perspective on this, because I could give a laundry list of 20 things and the patient might be like, I'll do this and that. I'm like, great. So you're going to walk in nature every day and you're going to do breath work. Fantastic. So we just want you to be able to do things, not just Thursday at 5 o'clock. We want you to be able to do things every single day that you can do consistently that make your autonomic nervous system calm down. So things as simple as 4 to 5 deep breaths before you eat a meal. Like, consistently, when people have asked me, what are the things that help with stress management? I'm like, well, most women are standing up and eating. I used to stand and dictate. I would be in the office or the hospital. I would have a protein bar in one hand, or maybe my lunch, and I would be dictating and I'd be eating and still seeing patients in between. So was my body primed to be able to be in a parasympathetic state? Absolutely not. People eat off their kids' plates. They eat in the car. They eat when they're arguing with their spouse. Not ways to digest food or be able to assimilate, absorb, and detoxify, or even eliminate. So 4 to 5 deep breaths before a meal, thinking thoughtfully about not being distracted. One thing that I noticed 10 years ago was I had so many years of not being able to eat lunch in peace with distractions, between a cell phone, a pager, overhead pages in the hospital, which thank God they stopped doing that. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm just sitting at my sunroom table looking outside at nature while I'm eating, like something that simple. But I think for each patient, it's figuring out what are the things they like to do. And this is way before we talk about vagal tone devices, although I think they're very important. I think that for a lot of individuals, they've got to dial in on the day-to-day simple things that they can do anywhere, anytime: gargling, humming, singing, breath work. Like, I do a lot of public speaking. What do I do before I step on a stage? I do box breathing. I like to meditate, but do I do that every day? No, because it's just consistently not something I can do every day. I just admit that. But I think we run the gamut from simple things that people can do independently without a gadget, all the way up to gadgets, because I do think vagal devices are really important. But a lot of the buy-in is, what do you think you can do consistently? Because I will have patients say to me, well, I heard you say on such and such podcast that oxytocin lowers cortisol. And I was like, that is true, but it lasts seconds. So yes, you can hug your pet, your kids, your husband, have an orgasm, do something that brings you joy, but that dissipates quickly. So you can't be dependent on that as a primary mediator of getting you into a less stressed state, because we acknowledge that most, if not all of us, are sympathetic dominant. Like I'm sure if all of us checked our cortisol levels right now, even though we're having this wonderfully engaging conversation, I think our cortisol will be up a little bit just by the virtue of the fact that we're engaged in conversation. But that is different than the chronic stress that most, if not all, women are dealing with. And that is worsened by the fact that by the time women are in that perimenopause to menopause transition, they're sandwich generation. Their kids are older, their parents are aging. At the time in 2024, when my dad was dying, my oldest was graduating from high school. And so we were sandwiched in this 2-week period of time where literally there was like the high of these wonderful things happening and also the sadness of watching your parent die in hospice. And I think for a lot of individuals that resonates because our responsibilities are so vast at this time of life that it makes it harder to cope. And that's why it just reaffirms why vagal inflection points become a larger piece of the conversation.
One of the things that we've talked about a lot on this podcast, and I want to get your take on it, is that it is the chronicity of stress, not necessarily the magnitude of it, although obviously to a certain extent, yes, severe stress is a problem, but low level chronic stress that you never get away from is really what's doing the damage. And that what you need to do is you need to separate you need to sort of encapsulate stress. And the period of time that you need to commit to being in a parasympathetic state or pushing yourself towards a parasympathetic state is not very long. It's actually not a huge commitment. And one of the things I've talked about many times is that if you can commit yourself, if you're a type A personality, if you can commit yourself to just 3 to 5 minutes every hour, okay? So basically when the clock gets all the way down to 55, 57 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes before the hour kind of thing, and just stop for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, stretch, go to the bathroom, get a glass of water, do something, call a friend, make a plan for the weekend, just something to interrupt that stress. That is so powerful because, and we used to have it with cigarette breaks. And we won't talk about nicotine, but people would take cigarette breaks. And you, by the end of the day, that the compounding of just those little 3 to 5 minute breaks, yes, maybe it turns out to be a half hour that you spent doing those things, but the power that you have still in your system, the energy that you still have, the capacity to do more work, to think more clearly, to be more effective and productive, to be present at home when you get home. Just those little breaks is what we're talking about. So you don't have to commit to taking a 3-mile walk. You don't have to commit to those things are great. Don't get me wrong. And we want you to do those things too. But if you don't have that time, you have to commit to, because if you start at 6 o'clock in the morning with getting your kids off to work or school and getting to work and plowing through your day and coming home and having to cook dinner and having to clear the dishes and all, if you don't take little breaks along the way, you're going to crack. Okay. Because as I say, going for a 3-mile walk is great. A 3-mile run is great. Going for a 30-mile run, you're going to have some soreness. Go on a 300-mile run. We're going to be picking up your dead body along the way.
Yeah.
So it's just little breaks that you need.
I think it's such an important point. And, one thing that I think is really unique for women, and I certainly didn't appreciate this until I started writing the book, The Menopause Gut, was the fact that our ovaries set the pacemaker of aging for women, most mitochondrial dense organ in our bodies. The irony being, if we have early childhood trauma experiences, and if anyone's familiarized with the adverse childhood event scoring joint venture between Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, anyone listening can get online and get access to a very short quiz. But we know women that are imprinted, their nervous system is re-regulated at a young age. They are more likely to experience more autoimmune disorders, higher cancer risk, more disordered relationships with food, poor metabolic health. And interestingly enough, there's certainly evidence evolving that they'll go into menopause earlier. So I think for a lot of women, they don't fully appreciate that cortisol is not a bad hormone, but cortisol over time, chronically elevated, is corrosive. It breaks down muscle. It lowers our immunity. It impacts our ability to susceptibility for infections. And so I think for a lot of people, they're like, yeah, I hear that. But as soon as you say earlier menopause, then people are like, what? Now they might actually, lean in and listen.
It's aging you
It's
faster.
aging you
So
faster.
the way I look at it
Absolutely.
is you've got these environmental stressors, which includes stress,
Mhm.
it includes toxins, it includes ionizing radiation, it includes bad diet, no lack of exercise, etc. They feed through your autonomic nervous system.
Mhm.
Your autonomic nervous system is the transition or the I'm trying to remember what the electrical term is, but basically it transforms those things into your metabolic stress. It transforms it into inflammation. It transforms it into aging. It activates something we haven't talked about is your nutrient sensing, mTOR. And when those things are activated, you are driving yourself towards an aging state. You want to reverse that. You want to use that autonomic nervous system, which sits right at it's the headwaters. It's the Straits of Hormuz. Okay, it's what you need to make certain it's working properly. Because if it's not working properly, everything else you will age faster. And that's stress. Those early childhood stresses, they are modifying how your autonomic nervous system is going to treat everything. And if it's treating everything as a stress, then you're going to age more quickly.
Yeah. Well, and I think about the women, I use myself as an example, high ACE score, ended up in ER medicine, then cardiology, love to have the academic and the intellectual rigor. But my little autonomic nervous system was revved high all the time. Even though people would say, you look so calm on the outside, I was like, it's like a duck. A duck is going across a lake. The duck looks calm at the surface of the water, but what's going on underneath? They are paddling furiously. And that is the analogy that I use to help people understand. You can tell me you are not stressed, but I know when I look at your labs, when I look at, we have certain quizzes that we use with patients, it is so evident to me that there is a disconnect. And whether or not that's the trauma response where you're like, I cannot acknowledge this, but your body, they say the body keeps score. It is the truth that, trauma is a wound and the body responds accordingly.
100%. Your immune system does not know the difference between being chased by a lion and being chased by a deadline. Your immune system responds exactly the same way.
Yeah. Hypervigilance is essentially what's happening there. The immune system is primed to think that things that are objectively not threatening are threats to your survival. And so it responds in a fight or flight manner, and it drives the innate immune system and the macrophages into this M1 hyper vigilant, hyper inflammatory state. And it changes how the mitochondria are functioning. And so it's really interesting, actually. It changes your epigenetics, but it's really interesting that the pace of aging in ovaries drives the pace of aging overall.
Yes, it is really the pacemaker. And what's interesting is there's now research out that, like, let's say my grandmother, so my grandmother's the World War II generation, the epigenetic changes that happen in her body and then my mother's body and then in my body. So the imprinting goes on and on and on. And so I think that, we can talk about intergenerational trauma, we can talk about all these things, but it is changing us at a cellular level. So if we think it's not important, we need to be thinking thoughtfully about the fact that now that we understand so much more about our physiology, it's like, oh my gosh, menopause is not just a sentinel event. It is an important kind of physiologic biomarker with which, now we see there are people, colleagues of mine in the space that are in their 30s that are talking about, they can map out biomarking and how well their ovaries are aging. And I actually had a conversation with Kayla Barnes, who you may be familiar with her work. And I was saying, we weren't even thinking about this in our 30s. It was not even on our radar. Of course, because you're in your 30s, you think you're going to live forever. But the point being, it's like now we have this profound understanding. It's like, this makes so much sense. Epigenetic changes in response to trauma kind of go from one set of eggs to another. It's like you are inheriting multi-lifetimes of trauma imprints on your epigenetics, which I think is fascinating.
Oh, it's unbelievable. It's amazing. And we're now finding out that if you're obese as a child,
Yep.
you will then, for the rest of your life, have a challenging time, even if you do all the right things. Your body is now programmed to be overweight. And so, that childhood health, of all the people that I want to see healthy is the children, because, as you said, until they have kids, all the experiences they have are going to be imprinted on their kids and on their children's children. And we know that people who are overweight, their children are going to have more of a higher risk for things like diabetes. So we have a generational problem here with obesity that's hit the United States, especially. We're going to have generations of problems with things like type 2 diabetes and heart disease and hypertension and all those things because we've programmed ourselves and as a result programmed our children to be that way.
Yeah, it's interesting now that I have a college-age son. I know that when, he plays lacrosse at a college level and is an engineering student, so smart, student athlete. And we were having a conversation about just his view of parents, people that come to visit the campus and people that he engages with. And he said, I don't think I realized how healthy you and dad were because I just saw you every day until I met a lot of other people's families. And I just realized we really are an outlier. And I said, yes, but it also means I'm passing the torch to you. So I'm expecting you and your brother to, do the same for your family so that it becomes, this, we just continue heading this down the road. But I agree with you that this generation, my boys were born in the 2000 age range. If things don't start to head in the right direction, they have the potential to have a poorer quality of life overall as a generation than subsequent generations. And that I think is disturbing. And certainly I'm hopeful that, some of these kids will start taking better care of themselves. It's not like genetics are a contributory factor, but so much of your lifestyle choices play an enormous role in how you age.
Yeah,
100%.
No doubt about that. I'd like to summarize kind of what we talked a little bit about here. I want to summarize that it sounds like in terms of creating as optimal an experience through the hormonal changes of menopause, that it begins in the gut. Whatever's going on in the microbiome, what's going on in the gut overall is relayed through the vagus nerve, through the autonomic nervous system to the brain, and through the brain and the autonomic nervous system to the immune cells. And that is going to relay and provide a specific level of function in the mitochondria. And if we do not have an optimal microbiome or a well-functioning one at the very least, if we don't have a well-functioning vagus nerve and autonomic nervous system, and if we have hypervigilant immune cells due to chronic stressors and traumatic incidents that may have happened in the past, we're primed towards mitochondrial dysfunction, which leads to aging. And I realize that's a very simplified summary, but for people that just want a take-home point, I think that's one that you can sit down and say, here's where I need to look. I need to look at my gut, my autonomics, my mitochondrial health, and my immune health. And those areas are kind of the areas that need to be optimized. And when they are, you can delay and push aging out and not accelerate that process. How does that sound to you, Cynthia? I'd love to kind of get your take.
No, it's a beautiful synopsis. I think, number one, there's so much that we can do to imprint our microbiome throughout our life. So if you are listening to this and you're like, I'm not metabolically healthy, I'm not physically active, you can change that. We know these inputs, prioritizing sleep, managing our stress, eating nutrient-dense foods, exercising are the majors. Those are the most important inputs for that microbiome. And we know the microbiome can shift in days. It is not something that you have to be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to do this for 6 months. I'm not going to see any benefits. Even though these 40 trillion bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protozoa, even though you cannot see them, there are more of them than us. And it's so important that we do the things that are beneficial. I know we didn't even touch on nutrition, but I always say fiber is the new F word. But fiber becomes a larger point of the conversation for another day. But there's so much that we can do, and certainly topics that I talk about in my new book, The Menopause Gut.
I love it. I think this is such an important conversation for us to have had, and I feel like we could go a whole nother hour, but I know you're in launch week and I want to make sure that we honor your time and help get this word out to as many people as possible. I've loved this conversation. JP, any final thoughts from you?
No, I think this is a wonderful conversation. I'm looking forward to your third book, which I suspect is going to be about aging. I'm excited about it.
We'll see. I'm still recovering from this one. And that's the beautiful amnesic effect that you get from writing a book. It's kind of like childbirth where you're like, yes, I want to get pregnant again. And in the midst of it, you're like, what was I thinking? What happened? But I'll be on the other side of it, and then I'll be able to facilitate thinking about another book.
JP keeps forgetting he has 4 kids, so he kept doing it.
Yeah, I
had the easy part.
I say I have 2, but I have 3 dogs. So clearly we're a little crazy.
I love it. This was just brilliant. Any final thoughts for anybody that was listening in terms of who this book is for and how they can find you and learn more about the Menopause Gut?
Yeah, despite the name, I know it says menopause, and younger women say, I don't think that applies to me. It's really speaking about understanding your physiology, your ovaries, your immune system, the microbiome, really talking about it it's really for any woman. It's for women that are already in menopause. It goes the gamut. And for men that love people that are going through this transition. So it is really applicable to everyone. I say that with genuine sincerity. Easiest to find me on my website, www.cynthiathurlow.com. If you buy the book in pre-sale, it's on sale officially April 28th. We will give you the pre-sale bonuses, which are things that you actually want, which will enhance your understanding of the book. It's not more pantry guides and recipes, which no one wants. But I'm active across social media, probably most active on Instagram. I have an amazing podcast, and you will be a guest later this summer called Everyday Wellness, which is one of my favorite things I do in my business. And then right now, my passion project is Substack. I'm really, really enjoying long form content. This has been a surprising, wonderful way to connect with my community and new people because, this is where I get to unpack more personal things that are applicable to my patients and my community as well. But that is my new passion project. So Substack, come find me there.
I love it. I cannot be more thrilled at how this conversation went. We've clearly synergized so much, and so much of what we do with our clients is so parallel. So this has been just great. And I think anybody who got to this point in the podcast should share this episode with at least 2 people who you think could utilize this information to upgrade their health. And thank you, Cynthia, for joining us once again. It was brilliant. This was great. So thank you so much. And we will catch you all on the next episode.